Good evening all, and welcome. I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who has contributed over at Forge Fiction. We currently have 8 options for Chapter 1. They are all brilliant. The voting is going to start in 1.5 days, so things are getting exciting. If you still want to write or are interested in knowing a bit more about the book I'm writing together with some of you guys, feel free to check it out. Link at the top of the description. I'm just really excited to see how this goes. Anyway, for now guys, I hope you can get comfortable to let the darkness take control. This happened a few years ago, when I was 13. I was somewhat popular in school at the time, and I had around 4 very close friends: Rose, Lynn, Noah, and Zach. We went on many adventures around that time: camping, road trips, the beach. Noah's family were pretty wealthy, and all of our families were pretty lenient with rules. One day, the summer before 8th grade, we went on a camping trip with Lynn's older sister Margot and Zach's older brother Todd. So there were 7 of us. Lynn, Zach and I were 13. Noah and Rose were 14, and Margot and Todd were both 17. We decided to go camping in a nearby forest, around 20 miles from Noah's house. It was pretty much in the middle of nowhere. Noah's house and his neighborhood were the closest homes, and there were no signals for phones or any electronics. We got to the spot easily and without problems, and we make camp. The girls in one tent, the boys in another. Maybe it was a bad idea to have 17s aged 13 to 17 with no phone in the woods, but our parents were lenient, like I said, and confident that we would be fine, since the woods were not known for anything bad or dangerous. So we set up the tents, go swimming in the nearby lake, and come back and make dinner over a fire, which was about 20 feet away from the tents, which were 4 feet away from each other. We have s'mores and do all the stupid camping things before Lynn and Margot announce they're going to sleep. That left Todd, Rose, Zach, Noah, and myself, as we joked around and told scary stories and just overall had a good time. Then Margot walks up annoyed and tells us that whoever is messing with her side of the tent to stop it. Keep in mind, no one had left the group, and tents were far enough away to not bother anyone in the tents. She explains that someone keeps touching the side of the tent, running something along it, and we dismiss her. Todd states that it was probably a tree branch, and Rose and I decide to go to sleep as well. So we head back to the tent. Lynn is asleep, and we settle in. I am closest to the opening. Margot next to Lynn, who is at the opposite side of the tent, and Rose is in between Margot and I. I managed to fall asleep easily, within 5 minutes, until I woke up suddenly for what seemed like no reason. I checked my phone. I still brought it, and a portable charger just to take pictures, and it was literally the middle of the night, 2:15 a.m. I looked around, my eyes getting used to the darkness, trying to figure out why I woke up. A tapping sound on the tent was what I first noticed, and a soft giggling. It sounded somewhat deep, like a male voice, but I couldn't be sure. After what felt like an hour, but was probably no more than a minute or 2, the tapping and giggling stopped. I was convinced it was my imagination, or maybe one of the boys were trying to prank us, or even a tree branch like Todd suggested earlier. Telling myself it was a tree branch and lack of sleep, I fell back asleep until Rose woke me up around dawn. Everyone was awake, and we decided to hike a little. We thought it best to go in 2 groups, because we planned on spending the night again, and we didn't want anyone messing with our stuff. Even though these woods weren't popular with camping, we didn't want to risk it. Margot, Lynn, and Rose and I left to go hiking for a few hours, while the boys opted to stay behind to fish, swim, and cook food. We hiked for about 2 hours, and we came back to the boys, not the campsite. Annoyed, Margot went down to the lake with Lynn to find them. Rose and I made our way back to the tents, and I'll be honest, I screamed and almost wet my pants. The tents were slashed. I inspected it closer after regaining some composure. I was usually the more collected one of the 2 of us. It seemed to be made with a small knife, as the cuts were small. Our tents were made of material that was pretty hard to cut into, and it seemed like the person had a pocket knife, I suppose. The boys, Margot and Lynn, came running to our screams, and were obviously startled. We decided to pack up and head home early, because for one, the tents were ripped too much to use again comfortably, and 2, Rose, Lynn, and myself were very creeped out. Even more so when Todd announced that his tires were slashed. We were freaking out. Obviously, there was no cell service. Todd's tires were slashed, and there was no way any of us wanted to stay any longer. Luckily, Todd reported that Margot's tires looked fine, and Margot stated that she would take Noah and Lynn, drop them off, and call 911 and their parents, and come back for us. She drove a car, and there wasn't enough room for more than 3 people, as the back was filled up with the camping stuff. Zach, Todd, Rose and I were left at the campground, and we decided to begin a little hike back towards the main road, so Margot wouldn't have to drive so far. Rose and I also refused to stay anywhere near the camp area. We began hiking, and my phone died. The last time I looked at it was at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Zach and Rose both had working phones, and constantly updated us on how far we were and had been walking. I began to hear branches snapping from behind us, closer to the trees than we walked. And as I got more and more paranoid as time went on, I told Todd, and he seemed to get more wary of our surroundings, constantly looking over his shoulder. We had been running for about 30 minutes. Margot was probably at Noah's house, or almost there, when Todd screamed, "Run." Naturally, I looked behind my shoulder before I began running. 3 hooded figures were running towards us. 2 had knives, and they all looked around 6 feet or taller. Todd was 6'1", but I doubt he could defend us against the 3 of them. Even though it was broad daylight, I couldn't make out any facial features. They all appeared over or around 200 pounds. The shortest one was probably 6'2", and they all wore hoodies and had masks on, like ski masks. It sounds totally fake, and I don't care if you believe me, but I was scared out of my mind that day. We began running, and the 3 guys finally gave up, or decided that we weren't worth terrorizing because we lost them. We made it until the main road, where we waited, walking quietly, constantly looking over our shoulders in fear, until Margot arrived. We told the police everything, and they searched the woods nearby. They never found any evidence we had been there, or that the guys were there, or that anything happened besides the pictures of the lake around the area and the shredded tents. I don't know what would have happened if they'd have caught us. I'm fairly tall. I was around 5'10" during this time, but only 125 pounds. Rose was about 5'2" and 100 pounds, and Zach was barely 5'9" at the time. He probably outweighed me by 10 pounds max. I'm so thankful we saw them before it was too late. I have no doubt they would have been able to catch us if Todd hadn't been looking over his shoulders constantly. And I'm so thankful we all got physical activity regularly and were fast enough to outrun them, and that they gave up. Whoever you are, let's never meet again. It was the beginning of summer. My darling husband Jay and I were going camping at my favorite place in the whole world. This was a wilderness campground with a crystal clear lake and hiking trails, a river for canoeing and fishing. This was going to be a special weekend where we leave the kids, carers, all behind for just some time for the two of us. It was Saturday morning and Jay had to work, so it was a little while before we could leave. We got to the place we were going and there were only two of us. So we set up our tent and did all of that kind of stuff before we went hiking and had a picnic by the waterfall. Later we came back to camp, built a fire, shared a bottle of wine until the darkness and fireflies set in. It was a full moon and everything was beautiful. I got this brilliant idea to do something I have done many times. I wanted to go skinny dipping in the lake. Well, Jay had already drank too much, and he was really tired from having to work earlier that day and all the hiking, and he didn't want to go. Also, there was no one camping except the two of us. If there had been, I wouldn't have gone, at least not skinny dipping. But I felt grimy and sweaty, and just wanted to be able to sleep without cleaning up. So Jay decides to lie down and rest in the tent, and I take off down the moonlit trail, my beach bag loaded with biodegradable soap and shampoo, change of clothes, and other bath items. While walking down to the lake, my spidey senses kind of picked up on something, but I ignored it. So once I got there, I undressed, put my clothes on the root of a big old pine tree, and dove in. I bathed, swam, and enjoyed the relaxation. It was almost like a trip to the spa for me. Finally I got out. I was standing on the shore getting dressed, and I had that funny little feeling gnawing at me, like when you're being watched. My concern was not a person. This time of year we had not seen a soul all day long, and no one lived nearby. My concern was that there could be a bear or some other wild animal. Just to describe the lake. This lake kind of sits like in a bowl. There is a cliff, but it's not a steep cliff. It slopes, and there are trees and forests surrounding it. So while getting dressed, I looked up towards the cliff, and my heart felt as if it were about to stop. A person stepped out of the shadow of the trees. Just from his silhouette, I thought it was Jay, as I couldn't see his face. Maybe he changed his mind about swimming, which was unlikely, since when he goes to sleep, he sleeps like a log. Or maybe he was worried about me. I had been enjoying the lake so much, I had probably been there at least an hour. So just assuming it was him, I started joking with him. "Sorry, but you missed a great swim," or something like that. Normally he would joke back with me or say something grumpy if he was irritated that I'd been down there too long. But I received no reply. All the while, I'm putting on my clothes, still talking to him, but he never said a word. When I had my clothes on and was ready to start walking back, he stepped back into the shadows of the forest. At that point, I'm pretty sure it wasn't Jay. So I grabbed my stuff and ran down the trail as fast as I could. One time, I thought I heard voices, but I was so scared I could have imagined it. I got back to Jay, and of course he was sound asleep. I was ready to pack up and go home, and thoroughly creeped out about being watched like that. But I couldn't get him up. I didn't sleep until he got up the next morning to make coffee. Every noise I heard that night, I thought it was whoever was that guy watching me. Jay was very upset and scared for me when I told him what happened, and we hiked to the place where I saw the guy standing, and there were 2 sets of footprints there from what we could tell. That was one of the scariest experiences I've ever had. I think about how vulnerable I was in that lake, and it creeped me out about someone watching me swim and whilst getting dressed. Anyway, creepy stranger or strangers, let's not meet. To this day I still have no idea who those people or that person was, but I will never take a moonlight swim alone. This happened back in the fall of either 2002 or 3, when I was roughly 12 or 13, near Clinton Lake, Kansas, on a Boy Scout campout. I still go backpacking and camping a lot, but this was the last camping trip I remember attending before moving states. We arrived at our campsite on a Friday and planned on staying through Saturday and leaving Sunday morning. I remember us having to set our tents up in the rainy Friday evening, but Saturday was sunny and gorgeous. I don't remember every precise detail, but right before we went out to hike that morning, an old van, perhaps a late 70s model, pulled into a campsite within view of ours. These guys were hippies, with a capital H, and it was my first exposure to what weed smells like, when some of us asked if a skunk was nearby. They were too far away for us to hear any specific conversations, but even the adult leaders found this to be a funny sight. One of the leaders, I think, went over there and asked them to stop using drugs in front of us, or to move campsites. When we got back from our day hike, those hippies were still at the same campsite, and so baked. They couldn't play their instruments with any skill, and here is where it got weird. By the time the sun was setting, the group of stoners had completely ditched their hippie attire, and had dressed in a total goth style. Some had makeup that made their faces unnaturally pale. Others had black trench coats on, and they must have had a stereo, because all we could hear over there was grunge metal. That night, after we cooked and ate dinner, all the scouts, including myself, headed out into an open area of the campgrounds to play capture the flag. We collectively established the boundaries, which were still pretty close to the group of new goths, but it gave us a different angle to view their sight. I doubt they had any idea we were there, since we played with no flashlight. By this point, the grunge metal had been replaced with this creepy, ominous opera music. I succumbed to curiosity, but I wasn't about to sneak into their campsite. I just crept a little closer to see what they were doing. They had made a large campfire, beyond legal limits, and I couldn't see any of the group. On a tree, I saw something that had me initially freaked out, but I figured they were still feeling with weed, and any other drugs they may have taken for this to be real, and continued to play. I think we only played one game, and then retired to our tents. At some point in the middle of the night, all of our adult leaders woke us up, and told us to quickly and quietly pack our things and take our tents down, and to get back to the bus. As we were packing everything up, we couldn't help but notice the bonfire was still going strong, but the music stopped, and we heard people talking. Their tone didn't sound like casual conversation either, but I couldn't hear specific words. I don't know how to describe it. Once everyone and everything was in the bus, the driver got us the hell out of there. The adults were abnormally quiet, and the scouts had congregated to the back of the bus. I don't remember if one of us told the adults about those guys, but we knew it had to have been regarding that strange group. A fellow scout from the other CTF team had also tried sneaking into their campsite and saw the same thing I did. Ever since, I'm inclined to think what we saw was real, and a reason for us cutting the trip short. Hanging from the tree, he and I had seen a decapitated dog and 2 severed human legs. I never learnt anything more about that night. Back in 2011, I was within a circle of friends that made it a tradition to go camping at a certain spot every May long weekend. The spot we chose was in a beautiful area, right on the edge of a large lake, and was located on government land. The lake itself had a dam on it, so during May long, the water levels were always low, if not completely empty, making it possible to walk across it. People were allowed to camp there, as long as they weren't causing trouble or making a mess, and it was generally a good time for everyone. The spots themselves were spaced far enough apart that you had your own privacy. Not far enough that you couldn't meet other people. In this particular year, our spot was in the middle of a small hill, with one campsite below us and one above us. The first night of our trip happened without incident. During the second day, the people staying at the site below us had moved in. We didn't think much of it, and continued drinking throughout the day and into the night. At about around midnight, the people at the campsite below us were really out of control. They were yelling and screaming, and their music had gotten even louder. So our friend Ben went down to ask them to turn it down. He was promptly punched in the face, and came back to inform us that he was 90% sure they were on drugs. After that, the vibe wasn't as relaxed, as we were all somewhat on edge. I was feeling really tired, so just decided to go to bed. Some of my friends were still awake, including Ben, and one couple, Lily and Derek, were at a different campsite, visiting friends that we'd met that day. I could hear that the campsite below was still blasting their music and partying pretty hard, but I just tried to ignore it and go to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I was jolted awake. Parts of this are somewhat of a blur. All I know is that I sat straight up as soon as I heard the screaming and yelling coming from outside my tent. I quickly ran outside to find our campsite in chaos. One of my friends was clutching their chest. People were running around and screaming to call 911, and I was quickly informed of what happened. Apparently, not long after I had gone to bed, the people camping at the site below us decided that they weren't finished talking to Ben, and on their way up, they had encountered Lily and Derek walking back. Now Derek and Ben are roughly the same height and have the same colour hair, so they just assumed that Derek was Ben and bottled him and Lily over the head with a full glass bottle. I don't know if it was the same guys that showed up at our campsite, but I was told that everyone else was sitting around the fire when 2 or 3 huge guys appeared from the darkness and walked over to them. One of them had a paring knife and the other had a butcher's knife. Ben saw the knives and had gotten up to talk to them, and had barely spoken a few words when the guy with the paring knife stabbed him once in the chest. At the same time, The people from the campsite above had seen the guys coming down to help. One of the guys, Tim, was coming down the hill when the guy with the butcher's knife ran up to him and stabbed him in the stomach. From there, sheer panic ensued. People called 911, but the ambulance was over half an hour away. This is where I come out of my tent. Tim's wound was bleeding profusely, and he was losing blood way too quickly. His friends ended up putting him in the back of his car and speeding off to meet the ambulance halfway. Ben was also bleeding, but his wound wasn't as deep as Tim's, and we were able to keep him calm until the ambulance arrived. The guy with the knives ran off into the darkness, back down to their campsite, and took off in their Land Rover. My boyfriend at the time and I had gotten into his car and driven to the entrance to try and flag down the policemen on their way to the scene. Once they arrived, we were informed to stay in the car, as they had released a canine search unit to hunt down the people who stabbed our friends. By the end of the night, they had arrested the men. They had tried to flee by driving their vehicles across the lake bed, which they got stuck in a muddy section of the lake. They were on a concoction of several drugs, as suspected. Luckily, both Tim and Ben survived, although Tim had lost a lot of blood and took a few weeks to recover from his wound. Derek and Lily had huge goose eggs, and possibly one person had a concussion, but I can't recall. It was definitely the scariest thing I have ever experienced, and a few of us had to testify against them in court. There was also an online article in the description if anyone is interested in reading it. It was over 20 years ago in southern Missouri. Me, 17, and a friend of 16 were out camping. We were at least 1.5 miles from our truck. We were also at least 2 miles from the nearest farmhouse. We had set up camp in a small clearing in a dense old growth. The clearing was only about 25 feet across. Our fire and lantern light reached the trees, but could not penetrate into them. It was dense, and yet still had a lot of undergrowth. It was almost midnight, and we were about to go to sleep when we started hearing movement near the camp. It didn't sound like a bear, or coyotes, or a deer. It sounded more like a heavy-set person walking around. We were armed, but were getting very nervous. My friend called out, "Who's there?" and the walking stopped. Then we heard, "Hoo, hoo, ah, ah," to one side. Then, on the opposite side, we heard a very similar call. It sounded almost like something you'd hear a chimpanzee or an ape make, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My friend's eyes were huge as he mouthed, "What the hell is that?" I shrugged. I didn't have a clue what it was. We were shining our lights at the trees, but even our flashlights couldn't penetrate the forest. My friend yelled out again, "Who's there?" And that's when it got even weirder. We heard the same call as before again, but this time it was followed by an earth-shattering crack. It sounded like something was slamming a tree with another freaking tree. It was so loud, about as loud as a rifle shot. Then it happened 2 more times just as loudly. It did not sound far off, yet we still couldn't see anything with our lights. There was again another answering call from the opposite side of the camp. That one seemed to be coming from further away than the first one, and also seemed to have moved around a little closer to the first one. We were still shining our lights around, but never did see anything. Didn't even make any movement in the light. It was just too dense. We kept hearing movement in the woods, but it was moving away from us. After a little bit, all was quiet. We never did sleep that night. The only thing I can equate to the calls we heard are to a chimpanzee or an ape. It's the only thing I've ever heard that sounds similar to what we heard that night. Yet it wasn't exactly the same as a chimp's or an ape's. Those loud cracks we heard sounded like a wooden baseball bat hitting a tree, but way louder. I've heard cougars, coyotes, deer calls, and everything else that's native to southern Missouri, and I still had never heard this before, and still haven't heard anything like it since. I still don't know what we heard that night, and I probably never will. Growing up, every summer in July/August, my family would get together and camp out for 2 weeks at White Lake State Park in Tamworth, New Hampshire. Some of my best childhood memories were made there. Rollerblading, Nerf gun wars, flashlight tag, and water balloon fights with my cousin and neighbouring kids in the campground. When I was around my late teen years, my family stopped gathering together to camp out after my grandmother passed away. One of the last years I was there, this one particular memory has stuck with me. A little over 10 years ago, I was 16 years old. It was around 10 p.m. at night when I noticed I had a missed call on my cheapy little track phone. My family was sitting around the campfire, cooking s'mores and sharing some laughs, so I decided to go off for some privacy to return the call. I took a long, narrow trail that winds in between other campsites that, at the end, leads up to the bathroom. I wasn't going up to the bathroom. I just wanted to find an empty campsite and sit at a picnic table to make my call. There was plenty of those, since this whole area of the campground where I was heading was vacant. There were no other campers nearby in the area. It was quiet and dark, so I chose a campsite. I sat down at the table. The lights from the distant bathroom, from up on top of a hill behind me, were illuminating my surroundings just a little bit. I called my friend and was carrying on a conversation for about 20 minutes. As I'm sitting there staring straight ahead, I see a silhouette coming down the road in front of me. The figure is coming towards my direction, where all these empty campsites are. I could see it was a person. This isn't unusual to see people strolling through the campground for a night walk. The people I see usually have flashlights though. This person did not. I wasn't creeped out at this point. No reason to be. I was just watching curiously. As the person got closer, I could see a better outline that it was a man. I also noticed his pace slowed down. I kept my eyes fixated on him as I continued my conversation on the cell phone. A minute or two passes, and now he's stopped moving. He was just standing there in the road looking straight at the campsite where I was at. I don't know if he knew that I could see him. He was staring at me, and I was staring right back at him. He was a little heavy-set and tall. I could also make out that he was wearing a light jacket, and couldn't see much for facial features, but I would guess he was a man in his 30s or 40s. Alarm bells were going off in my head now. My mind had turned to mush at this point. I'm frozen. I was no longer listening to what my friend was saying on the phone. I was in a stare-off with this guy. Then he started to move again. He was tiptoeing towards me, very carefully, like he doesn't want to make noise. He puts one foot in front of the other, leaned forward in a slight hunched form, and it looked like he was about to charge at me. In that moment, I snapped out of that state of mind, of mushy, frozen fear, and leapt off the picnic table and started running through the campsite back towards the trail. Thud. I can hear him. He's trampling behind me. Leaves scuffling. Heavy set, fast footsteps. Footsteps that are getting constantly louder. I made it back to the narrow trail. Once he got close to where I was, I heard the sound of twigs snapping and an oof noise that came from the man, which I imagine is that he tripped, or maybe he got face slapped by a tree. Most likely he wasn't familiar with the trail like I was. Whatever the reason was, it caused him to stop chasing after me. I didn't look back. I just kept running, running, and running, until I made it back to my family's campsite. When I got back, they were still sharing laughs and smiles by the campfire. I broke down crying and was trembling. I explained what had happened. My aunt spoke up and said, "Oh geez, he probably thought he knew you and was coming to give you a good scare as a joke." She dismissed me. My cousin chimed in and said, "Yeah, he probably stopped running after he realized that he didn't actually know you, and feels pretty dumb now." They all chuckle and change the subject. I think I was dismissed, because no one wanted the good vibes of the night to be ruined, and the fact that I'm just a very socially anxious person in general. I was very cautious and shy. For that time being, I let them convince me that I was overreacting and overthinking. But here I am years later, looking back and shaking my head over this. I wish I were taken more seriously. But other than that one thing happening, it was still a great trip. It was time well spent with family. My experience makes me think twice about going for a walk by myself anywhere. I carry pepper spray and a mini keychain alarm on me now. I hope not to meet the campground chaser again. It was the summer of '97. I was 9 and scared of my own shadow. So this experience only furthered my fear of the world. My mum and I drove up from Revere, Massachusetts to Bear Brook State Park in New Hampshire to camp. My dad was going to drive up the next morning to meet us because he had to work. So everything was going normal at the campsite. We had set up the tent, built our fire, and all was well. It was still daylight when we noticed that the lone, greasy-haired man in the campsite connected to ours was continually running and leaping onto a wooden post, then attempting to balance himself on one foot. He kept doing this over and over. It was odd, but we just figured he was some lonely kook and had a good laugh at his expense. My mum thought that perhaps he was trying out for the circus. Cut to nighttime. Absolute darkness, if not for the campfire. My mum and I were sitting and roasting s'mores over the flames when we heard footsteps approaching from the other campsite. Out of the pines, the lone man stumbled onto our sight, and he was ghastly and ragged in the firelight. I could tell my mum was tense. She asked the stranger what he needed. "Hey," he mumbled. "I need your help in my campsite." We waited, and he didn't go on. My mother asked what he needed help with. The filthy man said, "I locked my keys in my van. I need you to come over and help me." He then looked over at me and said, "Don't worry, kid. You can stay here with your fire." I remember getting goosebumps at that. My mum said, "I don't know how I can help you with your keys. You must have a spare hanger lying around somewhere," suggested the man. And my mother told him that she didn't. The ghoulish man wouldn't let up though. "Yeah, you must have a hanger around here somewhere. maybe you drop one on the ground near your tent. My mum adamantly told him she didn't have a hanger, and quickly added, my husband will be here soon. Maybe he can help you. He's a pretty strong guy. Yeah, alright, the creep slurred, and he started to trudge away into the dark. But he turned his head and said, well, if you do find a hanger, come help me. I'll be here. And with that, the horrible man left. My mother and I barely slept that night. I felt her moving at every sound outside the tent. Looking back, my poor mother must have stayed up through the long night, worrying a butcher knife was going to slash through the tent wall. And so, morning eventually came. And when we stepped out of the tent, we immediately saw that the man and his camper van were gone. Later in the day, I heard my mum exclaim. I ran over, as she picked something up from the ground beside our tent. Staring at it, not speaking, it was a metal hanger. I also found out, later in life, that 4 dead females were found stuffed into metal barrels in Bear Brook State Park back in the 80s. I don't remember all the details, and I may have things mixed up, but I've left the wiki page in the description if anyone is interested. I've always been one who doesn't believe in something until they see it for themselves. I've always doubted in the existence of any sort of urban legend creature until last summer. I was 17 at the time. My boyfriend, some of his friends and I decided to go camping at a lake called Lake Thunderbird in Oklahoma. Oklahoma has a good amount of mountains, lakes, forests and such, perfect for wildlife. I've never been camping before, so this was my first time, so I was pretty excited. Our friends and us all drove to the lake and immediately started setting up camp. Later we all went swimming and fishing. It was a pretty fun day. Then it got dark, so my boyfriend's friend started a fire and we made s'mores and hot dogs and played music. The woods were pretty loud from all the cicadas, which made it relaxing. We were all sitting by the fire laughing and joking around, having fun. Normal teenage stuff. When it all got quiet, and something felt off about the woods. My friend Jessie thought she heard someone walking around. We all of a sudden got weird feelings, as if someone was watching us, and I realized one of our friends was missing. We called out his name a few times, and he jumped out of the ledge that stopped over our big tent. We all were kind of pissed off from scaring us to death, and we were getting really tired, so we decided to go to bed. As we were getting ready to get into our tents, a rock that seemed to come out of nowhere hit my friend. We all looked around at one another, and one flew by the fire. We yelled at whoever it was, throwing things to cut it out, and we waited to see if it would happen again. We never heard anything, so we continued getting ready, and then a rock hit me. My boyfriend's dog started to flip out. The dog was a police dog, and was trained to take down any size of person, so we were all getting really freaked out at that point. My boyfriend and a couple decided to go down and check to see who it was. They all had machetes and flashlights and headed out into the woods. 2 other girls, me and my friend's boyfriend, stayed by the camp and waited. We were all silent and waited for them to return. After about 2 minutes, which seemed like forever, we see our friends running towards us. "You looked like you saw a ghost," I said to my boyfriend. He replied with, "Much worse." They all said they saw 2 large bear figures walking on 2 legs towards the campsite. I was getting irritated, and the girls started accusing the guys of messing with us. They denied it, and seemed legit scared. We talked about moving camp to the other side of the lake, when we started hearing echoes from the woods, as if someone was hitting blocks of wood. By this time we were all panicking to get ready and get into a family-sized tent. We all got into our sleeping bags and tried to calm down. It started to rain at this point. The fire went out and all our stuff was still outside. So what do we do now? I asked. My friend volunteered to go grab it, but as she tried to unzip the tent, we heard a massive thud. This time it was super close. We all looked at each other in fear. Loud, heavy footsteps were getting louder, as if something was walking towards our camp. The guys grabbed their machetes, trying to act all tough, and yelled, "Leave us alone." A couple of seconds go by, and my friend behind me sees the silhouette of a large hand smack the side of the tent, hitting my friend in the face. She screamed as loudly as she could, and whatever making that sound ran off. The rain continued on. We didn't know if we should leave or not wanting to take our chances on running into whatever that thing was, so we tried to sleep it off. It seemed like forever until night turned into morning, and we eventually grew the balls to get out, got everything, and left. When we got out, we saw a rather large footprint in the mud into the woods. All our hot dogs were eaten, and so were the fish we caught. On the tent was a large stain of greasy, oily-like substance where my friend was hit. We all packed up and headed off. I've only mentioned this to a few people, and this was probably the most terrifying night we have all ever experienced. I will not be going camping again. So last summer, I booked a glamping trip in the next country over. The website looked beautiful. A campsite of 6 large yurts outside a lovely little village. Coincidentally, I had driven through that village before, as it's really close to a nice historic castle I like to visit occasionally. So we pay our money, and my husband, 2 kids and I pitch up. It's one of the last weekends of the summer, and it was lovely weather. The campsite was on a small hill, and the people who owned it lived on top of the hill in their farmhouse. We were checking in on a Sunday for 2 nights, as we were shift workers at the time. We passed other people checking out, and they all seemed happy. The owners of the site showed us down to our yurt, and mentioned that we were the only ones on the site for our stay this time, it being a Sunday. We were happy with that, to be honest, because with 2 young kids, it meant that they could make noise if they wanted and would not disturb anyone. When she showed us around, she did say that the yurt door didn't lock, but none of them did, which, okay, fine, because you don't lock a tent, right? The place was in its own mini wooded area, and it was absolutely beautiful. The owner also mentioned the kids would be safe to wander, because they had perimeter fences, as well as their dogs. The first night was fun. We had a barbecue, the kids played, and then went to sleep at 8. There was only patchy phone coverage, so we read until we fell asleep. Next morning my husband seemed out of sorts, but I asked him if he was alright, to which he replied, "Yep, fine." So I left it. We went out for the day and had a great time. The whole day was blazing hot, and then we got back. I was washing up after dinner, and the kids were playing a shadow game over the whole place. I felt eyes on me, and it went really cold. Honestly, it felt like something bad was going to happen. I felt dread hit me. We'd already paid to stay, but I pulled my husband aside and said, "We have to leave now. I don't know why. I've just got a bad feeling. Please, let's go home." Normally he'd try and talk me out of something like this, But he didn't. He started gathering the kids' stuff and our stuff and packed it away. We went into the farmhouse where the couple who owned it were sat outside playing with their dogs. My husband started loading the car, while I apologized to them and explained to them that we needed to leave because our youngest was feeling ill. They said how sorry they were about it, and then, just as I turned to leave, the man owner asked if my husband had been outside the house last night, 3 or 4 in the morning. I said no, and that he hadn't left my side all night, or else I'd have woken. He asked me if I was sure. By this point my husband was at my side, and answered no, and why? Well, says the guy, the security lights came on and the dogs started barking, and when we looked outside there was a man wandering around, who turned around and backed down the direction of the yurts. They assumed it was my husband. We both said it wasn't, and said our goodbyes quickly. I tore out of that place in the car, and then about 1/4 of a mile down the road, my husband turned to me and said, "You're right, I was quiet this morning. I didn't say anything because I thought you'd take the piss. I wanted to use the bathroom in the wee hours, but as I was about to get up, I heard footsteps on the decking outside. Not hooves or something on 4 legs. Something with 2 legs. I lay there as quiet as possible and hoped the kids wouldn't wake up or something like that. This experience still freaks me out to this day." I was visiting the Wyoming Tetons 2 summers ago. My boyfriend and I were car camping at one of the designated backwoods sites in the National Elk Refuge. We got to this site somewhat late, and it was hours past dark by the time we got our tent up, dinner cooked, and cleaned up. We stayed up for a while poking the fire and hit the hay at some time around 10:30 or 11. In the early morning hours, we hear a pickup rumble up. It has no lights on it at all, and the trek up was narrow, harrowing hairpins, with plenty of eroded edges and nothing between you and falling over 1,000 feet down. How did this guy navigate with no lights? Well, there had been another site just down the hill from us that was still unoccupied when we hadn't gone to bed yet, and we hadn't heard any further cars but this pickup, which pulls into our site and parks and the engine goes off. A door opens and we hear a guy get out and shut the door. Then he just stands there. We don't hear him walking off, or anything, or talking. Then the wind picks up hugely. We're towards the top of this massive butte, and the wind just starts howling and shaking our tents like crazy. Meanwhile, we still don't hear the car door open again, and it would be too loud to hear the guy moving. Creepy as hell. We don't have guns, but we have bear mace, so my boyfriend grabs that and a flashlight and gets out of the tent to see what this guy is about. There's no guy, just the truck. We're miles from tiny towns and half-mile away from any other occupied sites, and the rest of the night we didn't sleep. Between the crazy wind and the creeper, we got up at 5:30 a.m. with the sun, and the truck was gone too. My boyfriend says he thinks he heard it roll away slowly at around 3:34, but I didn't hear it, and the wind had died down some by then. Still no lights. Never saw the guy in or out the truck. I just heard him get out that one time. It was very creepy. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. So sorry about yesterday, no posting and all. I left a community post explaining what happened, but just going into a bit more detail. Basically, for the last week nearly, Pandora, who's my 1-year-old daughter, for those of you who don't know, wasn't eating much of her food. She just kind of refused her favourite foods, didn't want to eat anything, and we were thinking, oh, you know, because she's getting teeth, it's probably that. But then in the end, she started getting really floppy, really hot, and we took her to a doctor. And the doctor the next day was like, nah, take her to hospital. So at the hospital, she had to get like saline and saline injected into her throat every 5 minutes, and then we had to get this other stuff called Diarrhea, which we're doing at home every day. Basically, she's just going through a really bad virus. But being a new parent, it's pretty scary when this happens, and this is the worst she's ever been. Usually, it's never been this bad, so it's been pretty scary. But yeah, she's definitely getting better. Definitely a lot better. And thank you to everyone for the love and support in all your messages and reaching out. It really means a lot, and it's amazing that you guys are here and always also so supportive. So thank you. If you liked the video, I would love it if you would drop a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. I do like camping stories. I'm thinking maybe, I'm not sure. Maybe another long video tomorrow, but we'll have to wait and see. Depends how long Pandora sleeps for, in all honesty. Don't forget to subscribe if you're new, and press that little bell icon if you haven't already to be notified every time I post, which generally is every night at 1 AM GMT, England time. If there's a story you would like to share, feel free to send it to my Reddit page or my email. Both are fine. So yeah, thank you all so much for listening. But for now, guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.